When it comes to buffs and debuffs in Cataclysm, a lot of things change. Buffs where you think you know what they do will be doing things completely different, and other buffs that you expect to be in the game have gone completely. Well, most of them have not gone completely, they've just been amalgamated into something else. So Blessing of Might would be a perfect example, where it places a blessing on a friendly target, increasing melee attack power by 20%, ranged attack power by 10%, and restoring 326 mana per 5. Now this does last an hour, and if a target is in your party or raid, all party and raid members will be affected. Now what you'll notice here is this is basically Blessing of Might and Blessing of Wisdom put into one. Blessing of Wisdom no longer exists, Blessing of Might just does it all. Even when you look at a mage giving Arcane Brilliance, this now increases maximum mana by 2.1k, but also increases spell power by 6%. The priest's power word Fortitude just increases stamina by 585 as you'd expect, but there's also additional buffs that you've never seen before, such as Dark Intent from a warlock. But the main reason a lot of these buffs have been homogenized, where it's not only a priest that can increase stamina, there will be other sources which we're going to look at soon, is because 10-man raiding is going to be as important as 25-man raiding, because in Cataclysm, as you may or may not know, 10 and 25-man drop the same loot. Not the same amount of items, but the same actual items themselves. On the basis with a 25-man roster, it would be a lot easier to get all the buffs that you need over a 10-man. They've had to combine some of these buffs and debuffs to make it a lot easier for a 10-man team to be able to get everything that they need. So what class brings what buff? Well, the easiest way to look at this is actually with an add-on that I use when I'm playing on these Cataclysm servers. Many of these buffs and debuffs you'll be familiar with, like 5% crit or 10% attack power or even replenishment. But what you'll notice straight away is there's normally more than just one class that can bring these. So as an example, looking at the 5% crit, you know you're going to be able to get that from Leader of the Pack from a Druid. Hunters can bring it with several different pets. The Rogue's Talent Honor Amongst Thieves now brings 5% crit as well, as does the Shaman's Elemental Oath and Rampage for a Warrior. Now what you'll notice when we look at a lot of these is the Hunter can actually bring a lot of different buffs. He literally is the Swiss Army knife of buffs and debuffs in Cataclysm, because depending on what pet they're using, depends on what they're going to be able to bring to the group. For example, Furious Howl from a Wolf is going to bring the 5% crit. 10% attack power can be brought by a Death Knight's Abomination's Might, as you would expect, True Shot Aura from a Hunter, Blessing of Might from your Paladins, and Unleash Rage from your Shamans. What's really interesting as well is some of them bring them a lot lower than others. So if we look at 6% spell power, you can only get this from two sources. That's either from a Shaman's Flame Tongue Totem or a Mage's Arcane Brilliance. Now the Mage has got to wait till level 58 in Cataclysm before getting Arcane Brilliance, whereas a Shaman's going to be able to bring it as low as level 12. That's another thing you'll notice about Cataclysm. These big party buffs, especially like Mark of the Wild and Arcane Brilliance, they don't actually come to a lot later now, whereas Prayer Fortitude from Priest is still quite a low one, but that is only stamina. Like you can see with the stamina buff, Power Word Fortitude you can get a 14, whereas a Warrior's not going to get Commanding Shout, which is similar, to level 68. Then obviously a Warlock's Blood Pact from their Imp can bring it, and a Hunter's Courage Fortitude from using a Sylphid pet as a Beastmaster. Now, all of these give 585, so it don't really matter what one you bring unless, for example, it's increased by talents. Now, flying through all of these and what brings what without too much commentary in between, if you want the 10% spell power, it's going to be from an Elemental Shaman or a Demonology Warlock. If you want 10% physical haste, that's either going to come from a Frost DK, a Wind Fury Totem from a Shaman, or a Survival Hunter with Hunting Party. The spell haste comes from Moonking form for a Druid, Shadow form for a Priest, or Wrath of Air as a Shaman. 5% primary stats, which will be one that you might not be familiar with. This is actually from Mark of the Wild now, which, like I said earlier, doesn't come until level 30 now. But this not only increases magical resistances, this also gives you 5% stats. Of course, it does exactly the same as Blessing of Kings, which used to be 10%, but is now 5%. And a Hunter's Embrace of the Shell Spider if you're a Beastmaster using a Shell Spider pet. 3% all damage still comes from a Beastmaster with Ferocious Inspiration, or Arcane Tactics as an Arcane Mage, or finally Communion if you're a Retribution Paladin. Agility and Strength comes from Strength of Earth Totem as a Shaman, the same as Horn of Winter, and Warrior's Battle Shout is now Strength and Agility as well. Again, a Hunter can bring this with either a Cat or a Spirit Beast. Increasing armor by 4076 is still just Devotion Aura from a Paladin or Stone Skin Totem from a Shaman. Increasing mana pool is Arcane Brilliance from your Mage or Fell Intelligence from a Warlock. While they both give the same amount of mana, the difference between the two is Arcane Brilliance gives 6% spell power, whereas a Warlock's Fell Intelligence actually acts as Blessing of Wisdom as well. Replenishment can be brought by Resto Druids, Frost Mages, Retribution Paladins, Shadow Priest, or Destruction Warlock, so nothing really new there other than Revitalize. What's considered burst replenishment is things like Mana Tide Totem, Hymn of Hope, and Innovate. None of those have changed in terms of where they come from, but certainly their usefulness is not as good, because a druid's Innovate on anyone other than their self unless they're resto is pretty poor. The big one is Bloodlust and Heroism. Now, of course, it's always been the Shaman, but now the Mage can bring it at level 85 in the form of Time Warp, and even a BM Hunter can bring it with Ancient Hysteria if they're using a Corehound pet. Now that one's big, because having to only rely on a Shaman to be able to get Bloodlust or Heroism is always a bit of a pain. So now you've got 3 potential classes that can bring it. I mean, that's huge for 10-mans. Spell pushback like Concentration Aura from a Paladin can also be brought by a Shaman's Totem of Tranquil Mind. Your general resistances haven't changed, being the Paladin and Shaman that brings the majority of them, and the Hunter with Aspect of the Wild. Oh, and of course, the Priest as well with Shadow Protection, which basically sums up the buffs. But you can see, in a 10-man, you could cover quite a lot of these buffs just with something like one Shaman and, let's say, a Druid, and you're already off to a good start with the amount of buffs that you're going to bring. Chuck a Mage in there for the 6% spell damage as well. Any Paladin, really, to bring Blessing of Might. It's a lot easier to be able to actually cover all of the important buffs that you need with such a small raid size. Which then takes us on to the debuffs. So 5% spell crit vulnerability comes from Fire Mages and Destruction Warlocks. 4% physical damage taken comes from Frost DKs, Hunter Pets, Rogues with Savage Combat and Blood Frenzy. Rogue and Warrior we're very familiar with, but the fact that a DK and Hunter Pets can bring it as well is huge. 8% spell damage taken is brought by Unholy DKs, Earth and Moon from Boomkins, Hunter's Pets again being Dragon Hawks and Wind Serpents, the Master Poisoner talent from Assassination Rogues, and finally the Warlock's Curse of Elements. The 30% bleed damage taken comes from a Rogue's Hemorrhage if they was a sub-rogue, Blood Frenzy as an Arms Warrior, Mangle as a Feral, and then a few different pets being Boar, Hyena and Rhino. Slowing the boss's attack speed by 20% comes from Frost Fever from Death Knights, Infected Wounds by Feral Druids, again a couple of Hunter Pets being Tail Striders and Foxes, Judgments at Adjust from a Paladin, Waylay, which is a talent from Rogues, Earth Shock from Shamans, and Thunderclap, of course, from Warriors. Casting speed generally isn't an important one, but DKs, Hunters, Mages, Rogues, and Warlocks can bring this. Decreasing physical damage is, of course, going to come from all of the people that can tank, plus the Warlock's Curse, and a couple of Hunter's Pets. Reducing the boss's armor by up to 12% comes from Fairy Fire, Corrosive Spit from a Serpent, Tear Armor from a Raptor, of course Expose Armor from a Rogue, and Sunder Armor for a Warrior. The 10% healing received comes from the Hunter's Widow Venom or Monstrous Bite from a Devil Saw if they're a Beastmaster, Permafrost as a Mage, Improved Mind Blast as a Priest, Wound Poison as a Rogue, Legion Strike if you're a Demonology Warlock with a Felguard, and then a couple of ways for Warriors being Furious Attacks if you're a Fury, and Mortal Strike, of course, if you're Arms. Now, where before, for example, doing a Mind Blast as a Priest was not as strong as a Mortal Strike for a Warrior, they're all the same. We won't worry too much about Dispels or Cleanses or Crowd Controls because, quite honestly, there's not too much difference there. You would expect Purges, Dispel Magics from Priest, etc. The important part is the buffs and the debuffs themselves, because now you know who brings what. You can start building a really strong 10-man comp thinking, I want all the debuffs and buffs covered, or maybe just the physical buffs and debuffs covered because you're going to run a heavy physical comp, or the same goes if you was doing a spellcaster comp. But ultimately, that's where all the buffs and debuffs come from. The power of Hunters now, even though they do very good damage and maybe going Beastmaster is not going to be the strongest thing in the world, but being able to have a backup Bloodlust if you need one for a certain boss but you haven't got a Shaman or a Mage, you can see like a Hunter spot in a raid is pretty safe. But as always, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe. Leave me a comment down below. What are you excited about for Cataclysm? And don't just say nothing, because it's going to be good. Trust me. I'll see you on the next one.